In the high-back leather chair, billionaire George Brown sat motionless, his breathing deep and measured. To anyone passing by, he appeared to be asleep, exhausted from another grueling day of business. But behind his closed eyelids, his mind was razor-sharp, calculating. The floor safe stood wide open beside him, bundles of $100 bills spilling out in deliberate chaos. It was a trap, carefully staged. Too many times George had been burned by those he employed, those he fed, those who smiled at his generosity while plotting to take more. Tonight he would get his proof. George listened to every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the hallway beyond. His jaw tightened with bitter anticipation. Would this 7-year-old boy, innocent-faced and raised in poverty, reach for what didn't belong to him like all the rest? Or would he somehow be different? This is not just a story about testing loyalty. It's a story about prejudice, pride, the shattering of assumptions, and the unexpected moment when a child's pure heart dismantles everything a cynical man thought he knew about the world. The study door creaked open, and George's pulse quickened despite his outward stillness. Through the barely parted slits of his eyelids, he tracked the small figure entering the room. Michael Roy, 7 years old, wearing his usual faded blue shirt and sneakers that squeaked slightly against the polished hardwood floor. The boy had come to return a pen, George knew. He'd overheard Laurel sending her son on the errand 10 minutes earlier. Perfect timing. The bait was set, the trap was sprung, and now all that remained was watching human nature reveal itself in its rawest form. Michael's footsteps stopped abruptly. George could hear the sharp intake of breath, could imagine the boy's eyes going wide at the sight of more money than he'd probably ever seen in his young life. Bills upon bills carelessly scattered across the Persian rug, tumbling out of the massive steel safe like a waterfall of possibility. Each bundle represented more than Laurel made in 6 months of cooking. Combined, the visible cash could change their lives forever. George's fingers twitched against the armrest. His breathing remained steady, theatrical in its evenness. He waited for the inevitable, the small hand reaching out, the furtive glance toward the sleeping billionaire, the stuffing of bills into pockets. He'd seen it before with adults who should have known better. A child, raised in a cramped apartment wearing second-hand clothes. The outcome was predetermined. But Michael didn't move toward the money, not yet. Instead, George heard the soft pad of footsteps circling around the safe, as if the boy was examining it from different angles. What was he doing?
Calculating which bundles to take?
Planning his approach? George's cynicism painted the scene in dark colors, each second of silence confirmation of the ugliness he expected to witness. Then Michael knelt down. George's heart hammered against his ribs. Here it comes. The small betrayal that would justify every wall he'd built, every relationship he'd severed, every act of generosity he'd withheld. The boy was on his knees now, right at eye level with the scattered fortune. But the hand that reached out didn't grab. It straightened. George watched through his barely open eyes as Michael's small fingers picked up a bundle of bills that had fallen askew, turning it so the edges aligned properly with the others. The boy's movements were careful, almost reverent, as if he were handling something fragile rather than something he could steal. Mr. George works too hard, Michael whispered to himself, his voice so soft George almost missed it. Things shouldn't be so messy. The words hit George like a physical blow. He fought to keep his breathing steady, to maintain the illusion of sleep, even as something fundamental shifted in his chest. The boy wasn't pocketing the money. He was organizing it. Michael picked up another bundle, then another, his small hands moving with surprising efficiency. He created neat stacks on the floor beside the safe, sorting the bills by denomination with a child's earnest concentration. A $100 bill had drifted near the chair leg, and Michael crawled over to retrieve it, brushing dust off its corner before adding it to the appropriate pile. George's mind raced. This had to be a performance. The boy knew he was being watched somehow, was playing innocent to gain trust before the real theft. But Michael's movements held no tension, no furtive glances over his shoulder. He hummed softly as he worked, a tuneless melody that spoke of genuine contentment in the task. Mama says Mr. George has meetings all day. Michael continued his quiet monologue, talking to himself the way children do when absorbed in solitary tasks. He must be so tired. I bet he fell asleep before he could put everything away. The boy stood up, his arms now full of neatly organized bundles, and began placing them back inside the safe with careful precision. He arranged them in rows, largest bills in the back, working with the methodical determination of someone who wanted to do the job right. His tongue poked out slightly in concentration as he fitted the last few bundles into place. 20 minutes passed. George remained frozen in his chair, no longer play-acting but genuinely paralyzed by what he was witnessing. His legs had started to cramp. His neck ached from the awkward angle, but he couldn't move. Couldn't risk breaking whatever spell had fallen over this moment. Michael stepped back to survey his work, nodding with satisfaction. The safe's interior was now immaculate. Every bill accounted for and properly arranged. The boy reached for the heavy steel door, his small hands barely able to grip the edge, and began pulling it shut. The door resisted at first, too heavy for a 7-year-old's strength. Michael grunted softly, planting his feet and pulling harder. George wanted to help, wanted to jump up and assist, but he remained locked in place, an unwilling observer to his own transformation. With a final heave, Michael managed to swing the door closed. It shut with a satisfying click, the sound of George's fortune being locked away safely by the very person he'd expected to rob him. The boy wiped his hands on his pants, leaving small dusty prints on the worn fabric, and turned toward the chair where George sat. For one terrible moment, George thought Michael would approach him, would notice the irregular breathing or the tension in his supposedly sleeping frame. But the boy simply smiled, a small, satisfied expression that transformed his young face into something luminous. "Sleep well, Mr. George," Michael whispered, his voice full of genuine warmth. "Mama says you need more rest." The boy tiptoed toward the door with exaggerated care, clearly trying not to wake the man he believed was sleeping. He paused at the threshold, looking back one more time at the closed safe and the still figure in the chair, then slipped out into the hallway, pulling the door shut with barely a sound. George sat alone in the silence that followed, his eyes now fully open, staring at the closed safe. His carefully constructed test had yielded results, just not the ones he'd anticipated. He'd set out to prove that poverty bred dishonesty, that innocence was just a mask over greed, that his cynicism was justified. Instead, a 7-year-old boy had just spent 20 minutes of his evening protecting the wealth of a man who'd tried to trap him. Not for reward, not for recognition, simply because things shouldn't be so messy and Mr. George works too hard. George rose from the chair on unsteady legs, his body stiff from the prolonged stillness. He walked to the safe, running his hand over its cool steel surface. Behind this door sat millions in cash, the tangible proof of his success. And a child who'd never had anything had just made sure every penny remained secure. The billionaire sank back into his chair, but this time his eyes remained open, staring at nothing. For the first time in decades, George Brown felt something crack in the armor around his heart. It was an uncomfortable sensation, almost painful. He'd been so certain, so absolutely convinced that he knew how the world worked, how people operated, what motivated every human action. A 7-year-old boy in worn sneakers had just shattered every certainty he possessed. George sat in his study as the evening deepened outside his windows, the taste of his own bitter assumptions turning to ash in his mouth, and wondered what other truths he'd been blind to in his, determination to see only the worst in humanity. The transformation hadn't been immediate, but it had been inevitable. In the month following that night in the study, George found himself seeking out moments with the Roy family that he would have previously dismissed as beneath his attention. He started taking his morning coffee in the kitchen while Laurel prepared breakfast, listening to her talk about Michael's progress in school. He bought the boy books, good ones with hardcover spines and illustrations that made Michael's eyes light up like Christmas morning. He even found himself laughing, genuine laughter that felt rusty from disuse. When Michael told him rambling stories about his classmates, Julian Prescott noticed everything. George's business partner of 15 years had an eye for shifts in power dynamics the way a shark sensed blood in water. He'd built his fortune on reading people, on knowing when allegiances were changing and positioning himself accordingly. And what he read in George's behavior terrified him. Julian had spent years cultivating his position as George's closest confidant, the one person the cynical billionaire seemed to trust. It was a lucrative position. George's suspicion of others meant he relied heavily on Julian for business decisions, social connections, and management of his vast household staff. Julian had leveraged that trust into a comfortable, arrangement where he effectively controlled access to one of the wealthiest men in the state. But now George was smiling at a cook, ruffling the hair of her son, talking about setting up a college fund for a 7-year-old as if the child were his own nephew. Julian watched from the hallway as George knelt down to Michael's eye level, discussing some book they were both reading, and felt the cold grip of obsolescence tightening around his carefully constructed empire. The Roys were a threat, not because of anything they'd done, but because of what they represented: genuine connection, uncalculated affection, the very things that made Julian's manipulative brand of friendship look hollow by comparison. If George continued down this path, he might start questioning other relationships, might start wondering if Julian's decades of counsel had been driven by friendship or profit. Julian couldn't allow that. He chose his moment carefully, waiting until a Tuesday afternoon, when George was hosting several business associates in the main conference room. Julian wore his Patek Philippe that day, the $50,000 watch that had been a gift from a Saudi investor. He made sure several people noticed it, commenting on its precision, its craftsmanship, the way the diamonds caught the light. Then he excused himself, ostensibly to take a phone call, and made his way to the kitchen. Laurel was there, preparing refreshments for the meeting. Michael sat at the small breakfast table in the corner, doing homework with focused determination. His backpack hung on the chair beside him, unzipped and gaping open in the careless way of children who weren't worried about their possessions being stolen. "Afternoon, Laurel," Julian said smoothly, his smile practiced and warm. "Those canapes look wonderful. George is lucky to have you." Laurel beamed at the compliment, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thank you, Mr. Prescott. I'll have them ready in just a few minutes. No rush at all." Julian moved further into the kitchen, positioning himself near Michael's chair. "How's the homework going, young man?" Michael looked up, his expression polite but uncertain. The boy had never warmed to Julian the way he had to George, some instinct making him cautious around the business partner's too bright smile. "It's okay. Math problems." Math, the foundation of everything. Julian let his hand rest on the back of Michael's chair as he leaned over to examine the worksheet, his other hand slipping the watch from his wrist with practiced ease. The movement was smooth, honed by years of sleight of hand learned in his younger, hungrier days. The watch dropped silently into the open backpack, settling among the notebooks and pencils. Julian straightened, his hands now empty and visible. "Well, don't let me disturb you. Laurel, I'll let George know those canapes are on the way." He left the kitchen, his heart rate steady, his expression unchanged. Phase 1 complete. The meeting dragged on for another 90 minutes. Discussion of quarterly projections and market expansions that Julian barely heard. He was too busy calculating the timing, the approach, the exact tone of distress he would need to deploy. When the associates finally departed, Julian waited another 20 minutes before returning to George's study where his friend was reviewing contracts. "George, I hate to interrupt, but have you seen my Patek Philippe?" Julian's voice carried just the right note of concern, underlaid with embarrassment. "I know I was wearing it during the meeting, but now I can't find it anywhere." George looked up, frowning. "Your watch? Maybe you left it in the bathroom?" "I've checked everywhere." Julian ran a hand through his hair, the picture of a man trying to remain calm. "The conference room, the bathroom, even my car. I'm retracing my steps, but George, that watch is worth $50,000. If it's been stolen." The word hung in the air between them. Stolen. George's expression shifted, the old wariness flickering back to life in his eyes. Julian watched that shift with satisfaction. The cynicism wasn't dead, just sleeping. It could be awakened. "Let's not jump to conclusions," George said, but his voice had already hardened. "You probably just misplaced it." "Perhaps." Julian moved to the window, looking out over the manicured grounds. "But I distinctly remember having it in the kitchen when I went to check on the refreshments." I complimented Laurel on her work, spoke with young Michael for a moment. He let the implication dangle, unspoken but impossible to miss. George stood abruptly. "Julian, stop. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm simply stating facts." Julian turned, his expression carefully neutral. "But George, you have to admit, if something of that value has gone missing, we need to investigate. For everyone's protection, including the Roys, if they're innocent. A simple search of the staff quarters will clear them immediately. The logic was sound and they both knew it. George's jaw worked silently, caught between his newfound trust in the Roys and the reasonable argument that a $50,000 theft couldn't be ignored. Julian pressed his advantage. If we don't investigate and word gets out that valuable items are going missing, every staff member falls under suspicion. Is that fair to Laurel? To Michael? Julian's voice dripped with false concern. A quick search eliminates all doubt. Unless you believe there's a reason to avoid searching? The trap closed beautifully. If George refused to search, he appeared to be giving the Roys special treatment, suggesting he already suspected them. If he agreed, Julian's planted evidence would be discovered. Either way, the seed of doubt would be sown. George's face had gone stony, that familiar mask of cold calculation sliding back into place. Julian recognized that look. It was the face of a man who'd been burned too many times, who was remembering every betrayal, every disappointment. It was the face of the George Brown that Julian knew how to control. Fine, George said, each word clipped and hard. We'll search. But we search everywhere. Your office included. Of course, Julian agreed easily. I have nothing to hide. They assembled the household staff in the main hallway. Laurel stood with Michael pressed against her side, her face pale with confusion. The boy looked frightened, his eyes darting between George's stern expression and his mother's obvious distress. A valuable item has gone missing, George announced, his voice formal and distant. We'll be conducting a search of all staff quarters and work areas. This is not an accusation, it's a precaution. Everyone will cooperate fully. Julian watched Laurel's face crumble, watched her grip tighten on Michael's shoulder. The boy looked up at George with something like betrayal in his young eyes, and Julian felt a flicker of satisfaction. That look would haunt George, would remind him that trust was a luxury that men like them couldn't afford. The searches began systematically. Julian's office first, as promised, yielding nothing. Then the other staff members' quarters, each search coming up empty, while the tension in the hallway mounted. Finally, inevitably, they reached the small room where Laurel and Michael lived. Laurel opened the door with shaking hands. Please, she said quietly, search wherever you need to. We have nothing to hide. Michael's backpack still sat by the door, where he'd dropped it after finishing his homework. George picked it up, his movements mechanical, and began removing items. Notebooks, pencils, a well-loved action figure, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper that Laurel had packed for tomorrow's lunch. And there, beneath the homework folder, glinting in the afternoon light streaming through the window, was Julian's Patek Philippe watch. The silence that followed was absolute. Laurel made a small wounded sound, her hand flying to her mouth. Michael stared at the watch as if it were a snake that had materialized in his belongings. I didn't, the boy whispered. Mr. George, I didn't. I don't know how. That's enough. George's voice was flat, emotionless, but Julian could see the tension in his shoulders, the white-knuckled grip on the backpack. Julian, your watch has been found. You can go. Julian retrieved his watch, making a show of examining it for damage. I'm relieved it's been recovered, he said carefully, though how it ended up there. He let the sentence trail off, shaking his head as he left the room. As he walked down the hallway, Julian allowed himself the smallest smile. The Roys were finished. George's brief flirtation with trust was over. The natural order was restored. Behind him, he could hear Laurel's quiet crying and Michael's increasingly desperate denials, the sounds of a family realizing they were about to lose everything. Julian's smile widened. Sometimes the shadows in the hall were exactly where they needed to be. The weight of the watch in George's hand felt like it measured more than $50,000. It measured the collapse of something fragile he'd been building, brick by careful brick. Over the past month, trust, the most expensive commodity he'd ever attempted to purchase, and like everything else in his experience, it had proven to be counterfeit. George stared at the Patek Philippe, its diamonds catching the light with obscene cheerfulness, and felt the familiar coldness seeping back into his chest like winter, fog rolling through an open door. This was the feeling he knew, this bone-deep chill of betrayal, the bitter satisfaction of being proven right about humanity's fundamental corruption. He'd let his guard down. He'd been foolish enough to believe that innocence could exist in a world built on greed. And here was his reward. Hard evidence literally in hand. Mr. George, please. Laurel's voice cracked on his name. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she clutched Michael's shoulders. We didn't take anything. I swear on everything I have. We didn't. The watch is in your son's backpack, Laurel. George's voice came out harder than he intended, each word a chip of ice. I'm holding it right now. Are you suggesting it walked there on its own? Someone put it there. Michael's voice rose to a near shout, terror making him bold. I never touched Mr. Julian's watch. I never even got close to him. You were in the kitchen when Julian was there, George said, the prosecutor in him assembling facts into an airtight case. He spoke with you. He said so himself. But I didn't take anything. Michael's eyes were wide and wet, his small body trembling against his mother's side. Mr. George, I promise I didn't. The word promise landed like a blow. George had heard that word from so many mouths over the years. Business partners who promised loyalty while planning to gut his companies. Friends who promised discretion while selling his secrets. Even his ex-wife had promised to love him until death. Right up until she'd emptied their joint accounts and disappeared with her tennis instructor. Promises were just sounds people made with their mouths. They meant nothing. George looked at Laurel, at her red-rimmed eyes and shaking hands, and felt his resolve hardening. Pack your things, he heard himself say. Both of you. I want you out by tonight. Laurel's knees buckled. She caught herself against the door frame. But the movement was enough to make Michael cry out in alarm. Mama, please, Laurel whispered. Please, Mr. Brown, this job is everything to us. Without it, we have nowhere to go. Michael's school is here, our apartment is here, everything. You should have thought of that before raising a thief. The words came out colder than George intended. And the moment they left his mouth, he saw something break in Laurel's face. Not anger. Worse, resignation. The look of someone who'd been poor long enough to know that fighting was useless. That people like George held all the cards and people like her just had to accept whatever was dealt. That look should have satisfied him. It should have confirmed everything he believed about power and its proper distribution. Instead, it made his stomach turn. I'm not a thief. Michael pulled away from his mother, taking 2 steps toward George with his small hands balled into fists. His face was blotchy with tears, but there was something fierce in his expression now. I'm not. You know I'm not. I don't know anything, George said. But even as the words emerged, he felt them catch in his throat. Because that wasn't quite true, was it? He did know something. He knew what he'd seen a month ago through barely opened eyes in this very house. Michael must have seen the hesitation in George's face because he pressed forward, his voice desperate. The money. Remember the money in your safe. It was all messy and I fixed it. I could have taken it, but I didn't. I made it neat because you were too hard for things to be messy. The memory hit George with physical force. The boy kneeling on the floor, carefully stacking bills with concentration furrowing his young brow. The whispered words of concern for George's well-being. 20 minutes of effort to protect wealth that could have changed his family's life forever. And Michael hadn't touched a single dollar for himself. George's grip on the watch loosened. His other hand came up to rub his face, suddenly exhausted. That was different. How? Michael's voice cracked. How is it different? I didn't take your money then. And I didn't take Mr. Julian's watch now. Why would I start stealing? It was a child's logic. But it cut through George's cynicism like a knife through silk. Why would Michael start stealing? What had changed? The boy had had access to the house for months, had been in rooms with far more valuable items than Julian's watch. There had been opportunities aplenty, if theft was his nature. But there was the watch. Physical evidence, undeniable proof. Except George had built his fortune on questioning things that seemed undeniable. On looking past the obvious answer to find the hidden truth. When had he stopped applying that principle to people? Someone put it there, Laurel said again, her voice steadier now, though tears still tracked down her cheeks. Someone who wants us gone. Someone who doesn't like that you've been kind to us. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. George felt anger flash through him, but he wasn't sure anymore if it was directed at the Roys or at someone else entirely. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. Laurel straightened, some dignity returning to her posture despite her tears. I know how this looks. I know what you must think of us. But Mr. Brown, I have been stealing food from my own plate to make sure Michael eats enough. Do you really think if we were thieves we'd still be that hungry? The question was so raw, so nakedly honest, that George felt something crack further in his chest. He looked at Michael, really looked at him. The boy's shirt was clean but faded from too many washings. His sneakers had a piece of duct tape holding one sole in place. These weren't the trappings of a family that had been pocketing valuables. But the watch was real. The evidence was concrete. George sat down heavily on Laurel's bed, suddenly uncertain of everything. The coldness in his chest was still there, but it was competing now with something else. Doubt. Not about the Roy's guilt, but about his own judgment. About whether he was seeing clearly or just seeing what years of betrayal had conditioned him to see. "I watched you," George said quietly, the words emerging without his permission. "That night with the safe. I wasn't actually asleep. I was testing you, Michael. I left all that money out to see if you'd steal it." Laurel inhaled sharply. Michael just stared at him, his young face struggling to process this admission. "And you didn't take a single dollar," George continued. "You organized it. You locked it away. You protected it." He looked up at the boy, something breaking in his voice. "So why would you steal a watch a month later? It doesn't make sense." "Because I wouldn't." Michael's words tumbled out in a rush. "I didn't. Someone else did this, Mr. George, someone bad." George wanted to believe him. The wanting was so intense it frightened him. This was how people got hurt, he reminded himself. This was how you ended up betrayed and gutted and alone. You believed. You trusted. You let people past your defenses and then they destroyed you from the inside out. But Michael's face that night, concentrating so hard on getting the money stacks just right, the whispered words about hard work and rest, the complete absence of greed or calculation, that had been real. George's instincts had been honed over decades of business warfare, and every instinct he possessed had recognized the authenticity of that moment. So either Michael had transformed from a genuinely good child into a thief in the span of a month, or something else was happening here. George stood, the watch still clutched in his hand. "Don't pack yet," he said, his voice rough. "I need time to think about this, Mr. Brown." Laurel started, hope and fear warring in her expression. "Just give me time." George moved toward the door, needing space to breathe, to think clearly. He paused at the threshold, looking back at Michael's tear-stained face. "That night with the safe. You really didn't know I was watching." Michael shook his head. "I just thought you were tired. I didn't want anyone to steal from you while you were sleeping." The simple honesty of it, the uncomplicated goodness, hit George like a punch. He nodded once and left the room, closing the door behind him. In the hallway, George leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. The watch pressed into his palm, its sharp edges digging into his skin. Evidence. Concrete and undeniable. But evidence could be planted. George knew that better than most. He'd seen it in business deals and corporate espionage, in the cutthroat world where he'd made his fortune. People created evidence all the time to support the narratives they wanted told. The question was whether he had the courage to investigate, or whether it was easier to let the coldness win, to fire the Roys, to rebuild his walls, to return to the comfortable isolation of suspecting everyone and trusting no one. George opened his eyes and looked at the watch glinting in his hand. $50,000 of platinum and diamonds and precision engineering. And somewhere in this house, a 7-year-old boy who'd once spent 20 minutes protecting George's money without taking a cent for himself. The weight of doubt pressed down on George's shoulders, crushing and inescapable. But beneath it, fighting its way through decades of cynicism and betrayal, was something else. The faintest spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been wrong to trust after all. George spent 3 hours in his private office that evening. The door locked, his phone silenced. On the mahogany desk before him sat his laptop, and on the screen, a grid of security camera feeds that most people didn't know existed. The visible cameras throughout the house were obvious deterrents, mounted in plain sight to discourage theft. But George had learned long ago that the most valuable intelligence came from cameras people didn't know were watching. He'd had them installed 5 years ago, after a particularly costly betrayal by his head of security. Tiny cameras, nearly invisible, embedded in smoke detectors and crown molding and picture frames. They covered every room in the house except the bedrooms and bathrooms. Even George's paranoia had limits, including the kitchen. George's hand trembled slightly as he navigated to Tuesday's footage. Part of him didn't want to look. If Michael was guilty, if the evidence confirmed the boy's theft, then George would have to accept that his brief experiment with trust had failed as spectacularly. As every other attempt, he'd fire the Roys, rebuild his walls higher than before, and live out his days in the cold certainty that his cynicism had been justified all along. But if Michael was innocent, George found the timestamp. 2:15 p.m. when Julian had excused himself from the meeting. The kitchen camera angle was perfect, capturing the entire room from a vantage point near the ceiling. George watched the footage unfold with his jaw clenched tight. There was Laurel, arranging canapes on a silver tray with the careful precision he'd come to recognize as her signature. There was Michael at the small breakfast table, bent over his math homework, tongue poking out in concentration, and there, entering the frame with his practiced smile, was Julian Prescott. George turned up the volume, hearing Julian's smooth greeting, Laurel's warm response. He watched Julian move closer to Michael's chair, leaning over to examine the homework. And there, so quick that George had to replay it 3 times to catch the movement clearly, Julian's hand went to his wrist, removed the watch, and dropped it into Michael's open backpack. The entire motion took less than 2 seconds. It was professional, practiced, the act of someone who'd done similar things before. George sat back in his chair, something hot and acidic rising in his throat. Not surprise, exactly. Once he'd allowed himself to consider the possibility, Julian's guilt had seemed almost inevitable. But seeing it, watching his business partner of 15 years frame a 7-year-old child with such casual cruelty, made George's hands ball into fists. Julian had gambled that George's cynicism ran deeper than his budding trust in the Roys, and he'd nearly been right. George had been seconds away from firing them, from sending Laurel and Michael out into the street with nothing. The thought of how close he'd come to that decision made him feel physically ill. He copied the footage to a secure drive, then made several backup copies. Then he sat in the darkness of his office, thinking about the 2 tests he'd conducted. One deliberate, one accidental. He'd tested Michael with the open safe, expecting failure and receiving integrity instead. And now Julian had inadvertently tested George's character, revealing how quickly the billionaire was willing to abandon trust when it became inconvenient. George had nearly failed that test. The realization sat heavy in his chest. At 9 a.m. the following morning, George assembled everyone in the main conference room. Laurel and Michael sat close together on one side of the long table, their faces pale and drawn. Michael's eyes were red-rimmed from crying through the night. Laurel held her son's hand with white-knuckled intensity, her other hand clutching a worn purse that probably contained all their important documents, ready for the eviction she expected. Julian sat across from them, his posture relaxed and confident. He'd worn an expensive suit today, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, the uniform of a man who believed he'd already won. His expression carried just the right blend of regret and professional concern. George stood at the head of the table, his laptop connected to the large monitor on the wall. He looked at each person in turn, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "I owe you all an explanation," George began, his voice measured and calm. "Yesterday, something valuable went missing, and I made certain assumptions based on where it was found. I was prepared to take action based on those assumptions." He looked directly at Laurel. "I was going to fire you and your son immediately without references." Laurel's hand tightened on Michael's. The boy pressed closer to his mother, as if he could make himself smaller, less noticeable, less vulnerable to the power George wielded. "But something didn't sit right with me," George continued. "See, this wasn't the first test Michael had faced in this house. It was just the first one he knew about." Julian's expression flickered just for a moment. George caught it and felt a grim satisfaction. "A month ago, I conducted an experiment. I left my floor safe open, with hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash clearly visible and easily accessible. I pretended to be asleep in my study, and I waited to see what would happen when Michael came into the room." Michael's eyes went wide. Laurel turned to look at her son, confusion and understanding dawning simultaneously on her face. "I expected him to steal from me," George said bluntly. "I was certain of it. I'd been betrayed so many times that I believed everyone had a price, especially people who needed money as desperately as you do." He paused, meeting Michael's gaze. "But you didn't take a single dollar, did you, Michael?" The boy shook his head mutely. "Instead, you spent 20 minutes organizing the money and locking the safe, because you thought I worked too hard for things to be messy." George's voice softened on the last words. You protected my wealth when you could have changed your life by taking it. So yesterday, when I found Julian's watch in your backpack, I had a choice. I could believe the evidence in front of me, or I could believe in the character you'd already demonstrated. George, Julian interjected smoothly. I understand you've grown fond of the boy, but evidence is evidence. We all saw I'm not finished. George's voice cut like a blade. He turned to his laptop and pulled up the kitchen footage. I have security cameras throughout this house. Most people know about the obvious ones, but I have others hidden that very few people are aware of. Julian's face had gone very still. These cameras capture excellent footage, George continued, clicking play. High definition. Multiple angles. Timestamps verified by external servers so the authenticity can't be questioned. The monitor flickered to life, showing the kitchen scene from Tuesday afternoon. George watched Julian's expression shift from confident to concerned to trapped as the footage played out. There, crystal clear and undeniable, was Julian's hand removing the watch. Julian's quick glance around to ensure no one was watching. Julian's deliberate drop of the $50,000 timepiece into an innocent child's backpack. The silence that followed was absolute. You framed a 7-year-old child, George said quietly, his voice carrying more menace in its softness than any shout could have achieved. You planted evidence to destroy a family's livelihood because you felt threatened by the attention I was giving them. Julian's mouth opened, then closed. His lawyer's mind was clearly working through possible defenses, justifications, explanations. But there was no arguing with video evidence. Get out, George said. Out of this house, out of my business, out of my life. I'll have my lawyers contact you about dissolving our partnership. If you're smart, you'll accept whatever terms they offer, because the alternative is me pursuing charges for theft and fraud. And Julian. George leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I promise you I can make that process extremely painful. Julian stood, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. For a moment, George thought he might try to argue, to salvage something from the wreckage. But then the business partner, who'd shared 15 years of George's life, simply turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the conference room until the door closed behind him with a final, decisive click. George turned to Laurel and Michael. The woman was crying again, but these tears looked different. Relief, maybe, or disbelief. Michael just stared at George with an expression that made the billionaire's heart ache. I'm sorry, George said, and the words felt inadequate for what he was trying to express. I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry I almost made the worst mistake of my life by sending you away. I'm sorry that my broken ability to trust nearly destroyed something. Precious, Mr. George, Laurel started, but her voice broke. George moved around the table and did something he rarely did. He knelt down, bringing himself to Michael's eye level. The boy watched him warily, still uncertain. Michael, you taught me something important, George said. I thought wealth was what made a man rich. I thought having money meant having power, and having power meant having worth. He shook his head slowly. But you have something I've been trying to buy my whole life and never could. Integrity, real, genuine integrity that doesn't bend when it's tested. That's worth more than anything in my safe. I just didn't want your money to be messy, Michael said in a small voice. I know. George felt his throat tighten. And that's exactly what makes you remarkable. You saw something that needed doing and you did it, without expecting anything in return. Without even wanting recognition, you did it because it was right. George stood and addressed Laurel. I'd like to make you an offer. If you'll still consider working for a foolish old man who nearly threw away the best thing that's happened to this house in years. I want to establish a full educational trust for Michael. Elementary school through graduate school, whatever he wants to study. Books, tuition, living expenses, everything. And I'd like to triple your salary, with proper benefits and retirement contributions. Laurel's hand flew to her mouth. Mr. Brown, that's too much. We couldn't possibly. It's not nearly enough, George interrupted gently. It's not payment. It's not charity. It's an investment in something I'd lost faith in. Your son reminded me that good people exist, that integrity isn't extinct, that maybe, despite all evidence to the contrary, trust is still possible in this world. He smiled, and it felt genuine in a way smiles hadn't felt for years. That's worth far more than money. Michael stood up from his chair and, before George could react, wrapped his small arms around the billionaire's waist in a fierce hug. George froze, unused to physical affection, then slowly brought his arms around the boy's shoulders. Thank you for believing me, Michael whispered against his suit jacket, even when it was hard. George closed his eyes, feeling something fundamental shift in his chest. The coldness that had lived there for so long was melting, replaced by something warmer and infinitely more terrifying. Connection, real human connection, with all its vulnerability and risk. Thank you for being exactly who you are, George whispered back. Don't ever change that, Michael, no matter what the world tells you. Don't let it make you hard like me. They stood like that for a long moment. The wealthy man and the child who'd saved him, while Laurel wept quietly with relief and joy. Outside the conference room windows, morning sun streamed across the manicured grounds, and George Brown finally understood what it meant to be truly, impossibly rich. It had nothing to do with the numbers in his bank account. It had everything to do with the small, trusting weight of a child's arms around his waist, and the knowledge that he'd almost lost this forever. He would not make that mistake again. To all my amazing viewers, thank you. Every time you watch, like, and share my videos, you keep the echoes of love alive. Your support, your comments, and your time mean more than you know. This channel exists because of you. I appreciate you deeply. To all my amazing viewers, thank you. Every time you watch, like, and share my videos, you keep the echoes of love alive. Your support, your comments, and your time mean more than you know. This channel exists because of you. I appreciate you deeply.